Does Isaiah 9:6 refer to Jesus as the mighty God? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. Let's take a look at a very short video.
Shalom, my friends, and welcome to this video. This is a YouTuber I recently discovered. He's not Jewish to my knowledge, Dan McClellan. He claims to be a scholar of the Bible, and he had some interesting things to say that a lot of what he said I do agree with. So let's explore this from a slightly different angle than we usually do.
So in Isaiah 9:6, we find a list of crown names. And these are not the names that an individual would go by on a day-to-day basis, but symbolic royal names that would be given upon someone's accession to the throne.
So let's look at the passage just for those who might be confused what we're referring to. This is Isaiah 9, verses 5 and 6, or I think 6 and 7 in some Christian Bibles. So here's what it says, just to give you the English to understand what's happening here. For a child has been born to us, a son is given to us, and the authority is upon his shoulder, and the wondrous counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, called his name the Prince of Peace. Christian translations look at this slightly differently sometimes. He'll get into why that is, but what it says is, to him who increases the authority for peace without end on David's throne and on his kingdom, to establish it and support it with justice and with righteousness from now into eternity. The zeal of the Lord of hosts shall accomplish this. So he's going to comment on this just to give you context.
And the closest conceptual parallel in ancient West Asia would be Egypt, which used very similar crown names. And you can find either 2, 3, or 4 of these names in this list, depending on how you divide up the Hebrew, because crown names could be pretty long. And we see pretty long names in the Hebrew Bible as well. And in Hebrew, names were generally sentences. So my name, Daniel, is literally God is my judge. And again, names could get pretty long. And so while most Christian interpretations and translations will divide these names into 4, they could be as few as 2. For instance, the first 2, which are usually Wonderful Counselor and Mighty God, could be the mighty God plans wonders. In fact, in Isaiah 25:1, we have a reference to God doing wonders that he planned of old or from afar or something like that. So that could be a single name, and that would be a crown name. It could be 2 names. It could be Wonderful Counselor, and it could be Mighty God. Now, Mighty God would not label the king who bears that name as the Mighty God. It would represent some kind of divine authority with which the king has been endowed. And we see this in Egyptian crown names as well. Good God or Mighty Bull or something like that are some of the crown names that are attributed to Egyptian pharaohs and kings.
So this is usually not the approach that I take on my channel, right? I like to find things within the Tanakh and use basis for that, but you guys in the comments that have more of this, academic understanding of context of when this was written, maybe you can agree or disagree or let me know what you think. Really, what I usually discuss on this channel is more of what the Tanakh explicitly says, and then of course when Christians bring up rabbinic commentaries, well, we get into that as well. So at the end of the video, we'll discuss the rabbinic understanding, in the most comprehensive way possible. And then we will obviously counter the Christian claim, as this individual does. So let's keep watching. And please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. So thank you, and let's proceed.
And also in the Hebrew Bible, we have some names that would seem to label the bearer as God. For instance, the name Elad could mean eternal God or God of eternity. But the person who was named Elad was not being designated or identified as the eternal God or the God of eternity. It's just a name that is dedicated to the deity. So
right, like this is, like he said, Daniel, When you look at any name in the Tanakh, right, you look at names like Shmuel, right, for example, Samuel. Shmuel, right, could you argue that means name of God or God hears, right? Does this mean that this person is God, right? Just because a name like, it's just like, God is my judge or whatever these names are. They don't necessarily, just because they have the name God, the name of God in the name, does not mean that that person is God. That would just be silly and ridiculous. And that's kind of the hill that Christians are willing to die on regarding Isaiah 9:5-6, is that they will say, oh, look, it uses a name for God. Like, when you look at so many different names in the Bible that have the name of God in them, you're not going to say that these people are literally God. It's just a silly non-argument.
So there are a couple of ways to interpret what's going on here. And the least likely way is the notion that this list of crown names for the Davidic king is actually identifying the king as the very God of Israel. That's definitely not going on, because that's not a convention that was known from this time period. These crown names are following in the conventions of the time, and it was simply not a convention at the time to imagine there was a king coming up who was going to be the very God of that nation.
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, this isn't, like I said, anybody in the comments can agree or disagree with what he's saying. What I do know from the Tanakh is that this prophecy, right, is very relevant to the generation that it was given, simply because of the fact that it says from now into eternity. So there has to be some contemporary fulfillment as to when Isaiah made the prophecy. There has to be, simply based on that. I really think that's the strongest argument against the insistence that this has to be referring to God, because we know that in the era that Isaiah made the prophecy, nobody was saying, unless you want to argue that King Hezekiah was the Messiah, right? Which there is one opinion, in the Talmud that entertains the idea, but it's ultimately dismissed, right? Obviously, it's not something that Rabbinic Jews don't go around saying, but at least contemporarily. But the idea is that there had to be some sort of fulfillment in that generation. And of course, we know that Hezekiah was a wonderful king. He doesn't explicitly say that that's who it is in this video, but he does explain that rabbinic commentaries give a better explanation of who this is referring to. So thank you, Dan McClellan. And you'll see he makes that claim in a minute or so.
And even less likely, the notion that the king was going to be the second person of the one being or ousia of God. That's a Greek philosophical concept that would have been unthinkable in the time of the authorship of Isaiah.
Now, once again, I don't know if that's the case. You guys can let me know. What we do know is that from a Trinitarian perspective, this makes absolutely no sense, right? Because one of the supposed divine titles, right, that is given is the name. It says wondrous advisor, and then it says mighty God, everlasting Father. What is everlasting Father? Aviad. Remember, Christians in the same verse are claiming that the Son is the individual referenced here, right? This refers to who, according to Christians? Jesus. Chas v'shalom. But they claim that's who this is, right? They say this is God in the flesh in the form of a son, right? No contemporaneous context, because they don't believe this can refer to anybody but God, even though it says from now into eternity. But no, forget that. This can only refer to hundreds of years in the future, and it can only refer to Jesus, and it can only refer to the Messiah. And not only is this Son the Son, but he's also known as Aviad, eternal Father. So Trinitarians have a huge problem, because their whole thing is that the Son is a distinct person from the Father. Yet here, in this one verse that they claim can only refer to their God-man Messiah they call Jesus hundreds of years in the future, and not from now, but only in the future, from when Isaiah made this prophecy, not in the contemporary context of when he made it, even though the next verse explicitly says this is from now, meaning Isaiah's time, forgetting all of that, because why would Christians care about the contemporary context of anything when it doesn't fit their narrative, right? Painting the target around the arrow, this can only refer to Jesus, but the problem is that, is the Father the same person as the Son? It would appear, if you're going to argue that these same names are given for the same person, then the Father and the Son are one in the same person, which contradicts the theology of Trinitarians. It doesn't make any sense at all. So I'm sure Christians in the comments are going to be saying, you took that out of context, you don't understand the Trinity, you don't understand. This isn't rocket science. Like, if you're claiming that the Son and the Father are two separate persons, but the eternal Father is referred to in the same sentence as the Son, as the same... Christians, I mean, I don't know how they get out of this one. They really can't. They're stuck. And this is why Trinitarian theology just makes absolutely no sense, even when you use the passages that they insist can only refer to their Jesus. You have better answers, especially in King Hezekiah, but no, we have to ignore the contemporary context and can only refer to Jesus. It's like a parody of, like, the whole New Testament is really just a parody of the Bible or something. Like, it doesn't, of the Hebrew Bible, right, of the Tanakh. It absolutely makes no sense.
Even of Deutero-Isaiah. So it's definitely not the Trinity. It's definitely not referring to the king as the very God of Israel. These are crown names. These are honorific. These are symbolic. These are just talking about the relationship that the king will have with God and the relationship that the king will have to their people. And if you would like a better understanding of what's going on in Isaiah 9:6 without the Christological lens that so many interpreters want to impose upon it, I would recommend looking at the Jewish Study Bible or a Jewish commentary on Isaiah, rather than retreat to a Christian commentary that is only going to be looking at Isaiah as foreshadowing of Jesus, which does not allow the text to operate on its own terms, but instead gives the text terms under which to operate. And that's not approaching the text critically, that's approaching the text dogmatically. And the fit for this video...
So, exactly. So, he's effectively saying that Christians are painting the target around the arrow and saying bullseye, right? They don't have any sort of respect for the original context of the text. They just don't. He said, look at the rabbinic commentary, so let's actually take a look at the rabbinic commentary, right? It explicitly says here, right, of course, that this refers to King Hezekiah. One thing that Christians will insist, right, is they'll say that because it says from now into eternity, right, they'll focus on the eternity part. They'll ignore the part that says from now, me'ata, right? Rashi literally makes this argument and says, he talks about the eternity here. What does this mean? From now into eternity. The eternity of Hezekiah. And he says, so we find with Hannah, she said, concerning Samuel, right? So it uses that term, ad olam. That's the word that is translated, viad olam. These words translate to what is known as eternity in English, right? So let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 22. So it says, but Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, until the child is weaned, then I shall bring him, and he shall appear before the Lord and abide there forever. The same word, ad olam, the same expression is used. So if we're using the Christian interpretation, Rashi is arguing that, I guess, Samuel must be some sort of eternal God-man person because he abides with the Lord forever, right? And obviously that's silly. So Rashi knew what he was talking about when he was using that as a counter, because Christians want to make this all about, eternity, what does that mean? Right? Clearly, if it can be applied to Samuel in that sense, then you can't argue that it's exclusive to the, to a God man or the Messiah or something. So likewise, he further elaborates and says, in order to refute those who disagree, right, the Christians who claim that this Prince of Peace is their deity, we can refute them by asking, what is the meaning of from now? Is it not so that the deity Jesus, right, did not come until 500 years or more later? You have to ignore the contemporary context when it explicitly says from now. Another thing that I know he didn't elaborate on the names here, but another thing that is well known, right, when it uses the expression Kel Gibor, mighty God, that doesn't necessarily refer only to God in the sense of the pun, right? Basically, this is a pun on the name Hezekiah, right? Chizkiyahu means God strengthens, right? Very similar to the expression Kel Gibor, right? Which means something extremely similar. So when you talk about typology and you recognize that King Hezekiah was such an amazing king, right? When you see the way that King Hezekiah is described in Scripture, there's no real other king that is described in such lofty terms, aside from maybe King David or Solomon. But like, of all the kings of Judah, you can see that King Hezekiah is described in extremely lofty terms. So the fact that he was born after the reign of King Ahaz, obviously he was born during the reign of King Ahaz, and at that point he became king while Isaiah was a prophet, it would be remiss to assume that Hezekiah would have nothing to do with this prophecy, especially when it says from now into eternity. So it literally says he did right, what was right in the eyes of the Lord, like all that his father David had done. He abolished the high places, smashed monuments, cut down the Asherah, crushed the copper serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the children of Israel were burning incense to it, and he called it Nehushtan, right? This is the same copper serpent that Christians say Jesus is likened to being raised, right? Well, it's fitting, right, typologically, because that serpent was used for idolatry and was smashed. So Jesus met a similar end. So if you want to typologically apply that to Jesus, be my guest. Idolatry, perfect parallel. So it says he trusted in the God of Israel, and there was none like him among the kings of Judah who were after him. Nor were there before him. He cleaved to the Lord. He did not turn away from following him. He kept his commandments, which he had commanded Moses. Now the Lord was with him, and in everything he ventured, he succeeded, and he rebelled against the king of Assyria, and he did not serve him. So Christians will insist, well, his kingdom ended. He can't be the fulfillment of this. So the irony is that Jesus didn't rule in a peaceful period of time. Relative to King Hezekiah was able to actually save Israel from Sennacherib, right? The enemies of Israel, whereas Jesus failed to do that. So, relatively speaking, Hezekiah fits the bill for the Prince of Peace more so than Jesus could have ever hoped to. So the Christian says, well, just you wait, the second coming, then, you'll see the full fulfillment of this, right? Once again, you have to respect from now into eternity. You can't just focus on the eternity part and claim that that's exclusive to the Messiah. Because ultimately, there is not a problem with this having future fulfillment, to its fullness in the future Messiah. I have no problem with a sort of foreshadowing typological explanation there, and the rabbis don't either. The problem is assuming that this assumes that the Messiah must be a God-man, trinitarian person or whatever, and that he must be synonymous with the creator of the universe simply because it uses these names. And that's exactly what Dan McClellan debunked in this video. And I'm just reiterating that using the rabbinic commentaries that support that. So yes, if you want to argue that this will also apply to the future Messiah, fine, but you cannot ignore the immediate context, as Rashi clearly, demonstrably, and soundly refutes the Christian position that this has some sort of exclusivity to the Messiah, since even if we look at it from the eternity perspective, the same expression is used of Samuel, who clearly was not God, even though his name might mean name of God, right? That doesn't make him God. Just like using the names here does not make somebody God simply because they are called the Prince of Peace or called Aviad, when they're also supposedly the son and the father. Like, so thank you so much, Dan McClellan, for debunking further, using another perspective to debunk the Christian Trinitarian nonsense that they try to spew regarding Isaiah 9, 5, and 6. One thing, I'll just end with this. Christians claim that King Hezekiah's kingdom ended, so it can't be about King Hezekiah. Well, once again, comparing that to Jesus never even started a kingdom. Oh, it's spiritual. Oh, it'll come back in the second coming. Oh, it's... There's no tangible proof. Everything that the Christian contends to try to, prove Jesus is just fluff. There's no tangibility to it. It's just empty faith without any proof. Hezekiah fits the bill every time. Where you would claim that Hezekiah would have failed, Jesus didn't even get off the ground. What kingdom did Jesus have? Oh, you're putting all your stakes in the future, huh? Well, that's why I said, no problem with it being the future Messiah, but don't you dare tell me that these verses cannot apply to King Hezekiah when it says from now into eternity. You want to quote the Rashi? You want to say, but the rabbis? You better quote that Rashi to me, Christians. Don't whine to me in the comments that you found a Targum that says it's about the Messiah, because I'm not disagreeing. What I am disagreeing is that you're ignoring the Rashi that explicitly states from now into eternity. And you can find the application of King Hezekiah in the Talmud as well. I'll put the links in the description if you want. But that's where Rashi is getting this information, and it fits soundly. So I hope this video has been a blessing to you all. Please like, share, and subscribe. Shalom Aleichem.